The summer of 1943 dawns, a sun-scorched stage for the next act of a world at war. On the sprawling Eastern Front, the echoes of catastrophe still linger. Hitler's once invincible armies are reeling, shattered by the monumental disaster at Stalingrad. The myth of their invincibility buried in the frozen rubble of that city, a tombstone for the German Sixth Army. Yet, despite this crippling blow, the front has not collapsed. A fragile and tense stability is settled, a lull before the inevitable storm. The war machine, though damaged, has not been destroyed. Along this vast and bloody frontier, a massive bulge has taken shape in the German lines. It swells outwards, a great curve stretching 150 miles wide and 70 miles deep, centered around the strategic Soviet city of Kursk. To the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, it is a springboard, a perfect launching point for a future offensive to drive the invaders from their homeland. But to the German High Command, this Kursk salient is a tantalizing paradox, a dangerous vulnerability, and a golden opportunity. It is a dagger aimed at the heart of their front, yet it is also a pocket of enemy forces, ripe for encirclement. Within the Führer's headquarters, a debate rages, fueled by desperation and ambition. The architect of the German counter-offensive at Kharkiv, the brilliant and pragmatic Field Marshal von Manstein, sees a path to redemption. He advocates for a bold, decisive counterpunch, a final, monumental effort to seize the initiative lost in the snows of Stalingrad. His plan, codenamed Operation Citadel, is a classic pincer movement, a maneuver honed to perfection by the Wehrmacht in the glory days of 1941. The vision is audacious. Two massive army groups would strike simultaneously from the north and south of the salient. Panzer spearheads, bristling with the newest and most powerful tanks the Reich can produce, would slice through the Soviet defenses. They would drive relentlessly towards each other, meeting east of Kursk, and in doing so, slam the door shut on the salient. Trapped within this newly formed cauldron would be over 1 million Red Army soldiers, a significant portion of the Soviet Union's combat power. Their annihilation would not only reverse the tide of the war, but also deliver a blow from which Stalin might never recover. The gamble is enormous, a throw of the dice for the fate of the Third Reich. It would require stripping other sectors of the front of their best formations, concentrating Germany's dwindling armoured reserves for one singular, all-or-nothing assault. Some in the High Command, like the cautious General Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg, warn against it. They argue that Germany's strength is better preserved for a defensive war, that to risk their last Panzer divisions in such an offensive is sheer folly. The new tanks, the Panthers and Tigers, are still riddled with mechanical issues. They protest, and not yet ready for such a demanding operation. But Hitler, politically and psychologically, is a man in desperate need of a victory. The defeat at Stalingrad and the subsequent surrender in North Africa have shaken the foundations of his regime. The faith of his allies is wavering, and the morale on the home front is cracking. He needs a triumph to restore his prestige, to demonstrate that Germany is still the master of its own destiny. The grand, Wagnerian scale of Manstein's plan appeals to his own sense of dramatic gambles. After weeks of hesitation and delay, he makes his decision. Operation Citadel is approved. The last great German offensive on the Eastern Front is set in motion. The stage is set for what will become the largest tank battle in human history, a clash of titans that will decide the war in the East. It is Germany's last gamble. In the summer of 1943, the Eastern Front held its breath. The titanic clash between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was about to enter its most decisive phase since Stalingrad. The German High Command, desperate to regain the initiative after that catastrophic defeat, drew up a plan for a massive summer offensive. Its target, the Kursk salient, a huge bulge in the Soviet lines that jutted westward for more than 100 miles. The plan was codenamed Operation Citadel. This was to be the battle that would break the back of the Red Army and turn the tide of the war back in Germany's favor. But this was not going to be the blitzkrieg of 1941. The days of lightning-fast advances and encirclements of entire Soviet armies were over. The Red Army had learned, adapted, and grown immensely powerful. They were now a formidable, resilient force, deeply entrenched and well supplied. So, Citadel was conceived as something different. It was a plan built on pure, concentrated, brute force. A battle of attrition, designed to crush the Soviet defenses through sheer firepower and superior technology. The Germans planned to attack the salient from both the north and the south, a colossal pincer movement aimed at trapping and annihilating the Soviet forces within. To achieve this, the Germans decided to delay the attack, not 4 weeks, but 4 months. They postponed the offensive from May to June, and then again to July. Why? Because they were waiting for their new secret weapons, their new generation of armored fighting vehicles. They called them wonder weapons. These were the machines they believed would make their Panzer divisions invincible. First among them was the Panzerkampfwagen VI, better known as the Tiger. This was a true heavy tank, weighing over 54 tons. Its armor was incredibly thick, especially at the front, making it virtually immune to most Soviet anti-tank guns of the time, and its main weapon, the legendary 88mm gun, could knock out any Soviet tank, even the formidable T-34, from ranges where the Germans themselves were safe from return fire. On the battlefield, the appearance of a Tiger was a terrifying event for Allied soldiers. It was a steel monster, slow but seemingly unstoppable. Then there was the Panther. The Panzerkampfwagen V. The Panther was a medium tank, but that's a bit misleading. At 45 tons, it was heavier than most Allied heavy tanks. It was designed specifically to counter the Soviet T-34, which had shocked the Germans with its sloped armor and effectiveness. The Panther incorporated this design philosophy, with thick, well-sloped armor that provided excellent protection. It was also armed with a powerful, long-barreled 75mm gun that had even better penetrating power than the Tiger's 88mm gun at certain ranges. The Panther was a sophisticated, deadly machine, arguably the best all-around tank of the entire war when it was working properly. And finally, there was the Ferdinand. This was not a tank, but a massive tank destroyer, or Panzer, built on the chassis of a failed Tiger tank prototype designed by Ferdinand Porsche. This 65-ton behemoth was a mobile fortress. It had an almost unbelievable 200mm of frontal armor, making it impervious to any anti-tank weapon the Soviets had, and it carried the exact same powerful 88mm gun as the Tiger, but a longer version, making it even more lethal. The Ferdinand was designed for one purpose: to sit back, absorb enemy fire, and destroy Soviet tanks from extreme distances. This was the new steel fist the Germans were assembling. Hundreds of Tigers, Panthers, and Ferdinands were concentrated on the narrow fronts around Kursk. The German commanders believed that this concentration of unprecedented armored power would be an unstoppable force, a battering ram that would shatter the Soviet defenses and pave the way for a victory. They envisioned these wonder weapons spearheading the assault, brushing aside the Red Army's tanks and guns, and closing the pincers around the salient. The plan seemed simple, brutal, and, in their eyes, foolproof. But here's the crucial point. This delay, this waiting for the wonder weapons, was the second fatal mistake of Operation Citadel. The first, and most fundamental mistake, was the decision to attack at all. Why was the delay so disastrous? Because while the Germans were building up their forces, the Soviets were not idle. They knew exactly where the attack was coming. Their intelligence was superb, getting information from spies and aerial reconnaissance. The massive German build-up was impossible to hide. So, 4 months, the Red Army turned the Kursk salient into the most heavily fortified piece of land in human history. They dug and dug and dug. They laid hundreds of thousands of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, creating vast, dense minefields that were miles deep. They dug an intricate network of trenches, bunkers, and command posts, creating a defense-in-depth system with multiple lines of resistance. They concentrated an enormous number of anti-tank guns, more than the Germans had ever faced before, hiding them in well-camouflaged positions, and they amassed a gigantic force of tanks and aircraft, ready to counter the German assault. Essentially, the Germans had sacrificed their greatest strategic advantage, surprise. They told their enemy exactly where and when they were going to attack, and gave them months to prepare a perfect welcome party. The new German tanks were indeed formidable, but they suffered from mechanical problems. The Panther, in particular, was rushed into production and was notoriously unreliable in its early stages. Many broke down before they even reached the battlefield. The Ferdinand, for all its firepower and armor, had a critical flaw. It had no machine gun for self-defense. This made it incredibly vulnerable to Soviet infantry, who could simply swarm it with explosives once it got separated from its own infantry support. So when Operation Citadel finally launched on July 5, 1943, the German steel fist didn't punch through an open door. It slammed into a wall of steel, concrete, and fire. The wonder weapons were met by a defense of unimaginable depth and ferocity. The battle that followed, the Battle of Kursk, would become the largest tank battle in history and a turning point on the Eastern Front. The Germans' gamble on technology over strategy had failed. They had waited for their wonder weapons, only to give their enemy the one thing they needed most, time. The very weapons meant to ensure victory had, in a tragic irony, guaranteed defeat. 1943, the Eastern Front stands on a knife's edge. After the disaster at Stalingrad, the German war machine is wounded, but far from broken. Hitler, obsessed with regaining the initiative, plans one last, massive summer offensive. He believes a decisive victory can turn the tide of the war. The target is a huge salient, a bulge in the front line, around the city of Kursk. This operation, codenamed Citadel, will be the greatest tank battle in history. But what the Germans don't know is that the Soviets know everything. It sounds like something out of a spy thriller, but it's true. Through a web of intelligence networks, information is flowing directly to the Kremlin. In neutral Switzerland, a spy ring codenamed Lucy, run by a man named Rudolf Rösler, is funneling high-level German plans to Moscow. Rösler's sources are so good, so accurate, that some historians still debate who they could have been. Were they high-ranking officers in the German High Command, disillusioned with the war? We may never know for certain, but their information is gold. At the same time, thousands of miles away in Britain, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park are working around the clock. They've cracked the supposedly unbreakable German Enigma codes. Every day, intercepted messages detailing troop movements, supply logistics, and strategic orders are deciphered. This intelligence, codenamed Ultra, is shared with the Soviets. Between Lucy and Ultra, Stalin has an unprecedented view into the enemy's mind. He knows the where, Kursk, he knows the when, early July, and he knows the what, a colossal pincer movement involving the most powerful armored divisions the Wehrmacht can muster. With this incredible advantage, the natural impulse for many commanders would be to strike first, a preemptive attack, catching the Germans while they're still assembling, could shatter their offensive before it even begins. Some in the Soviet High Command argue for exactly this. Why wait to be attacked when you hold all the cards? But this time, one man convinces Stalin to do the exact opposite. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the man who saved Moscow and masterminded the victory at Stalingrad, has a different, far more audacious plan. Zhukov's logic is brutal and brilliant. A preemptive strike is risky. The Germans are still formidable, and attacking their prepared positions could lead to a costly battle of attrition. But what if, instead of going to them, they made the Germans come to them? What if they didn't just defend, but created a defensive system so vast, so deadly, that it would swallow the German army whole. Zhukov's plan isn't just to stop Operation Citadel. It's to bleed the Panzer off dry, to break the back of the German army on an anvil of their own making. He convinces Stalin, "We will invite the attack." The decision is made, and for the next 3 months, the Kursk salient is transformed into the most formidable fortress the world has ever seen. The scale of the construction is almost unimaginable. Under the direction of Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky in the north and General Nikolai Vachetin in the south, the Red Army, along with 500,000 civilians, including women and teenagers, works tirelessly. They are not just digging trenches, they are engineering a meat grinder on a continental scale. They construct 8 separate, concentric defensive belts, stretching back an astonishing 150 miles deep. That's like building a fortress wall from London to Bristol. If the Germans break through the first line, they'll only find a second, identical line waiting for them. Then a third, and a fourth, all the way to the 8th. Each belt is a labyrinth of interconnected trench systems, command bunkers, and gun emplacements. But the real genius of the defense lies in its anti-tank strategy. This is where the Soviets truly innovate. They understand that to defeat the new German Tiger and Panther tanks, they need more than just good soldiers. They need to turn the very ground against the invaders. They lay an unprecedented number of anti-tank mines, over 1 million of them. The density is staggering, nearly 4,000 mines for every mile of front line. There are so many mines that some areas are literally unwalkable. They create vast, hidden minefields, channeled to funnel the German Panzers into pre-registered kill zones. And in those kill zones, thousands of anti-tank guns are waiting, dug into well-camouflaged pits. They are positioned for interlocking fields of fire. The Soviets perfect a tactic they call the pack front. This involves concentrating large groups of anti-tank guns, sometimes dozens of them, into a single, cohesive unit. When a German tank column enters their kill zone, the pack front opens up a devastating storm of fire from multiple angles. The tanks have nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. They are caught in a crossfire designed to annihilate them. The entire landscape is re-engineered for defense. Hills are fortified, riverbanks are steepened, and strategic villages are turned into miniature strongholds. Entire tank corps are hidden in reserve, waiting for the perfect moment to counterattack. The Soviets aren't just building a wall. They're building a trap. Every detail is meticulously planned. They are creating a killing field, a purpose-built tank graveyard. They know the Germans are coming, with the most powerful armored force ever assembled. And they are ready. They have built a fortress, not of stone, but of earth, steel, and blood. And they are about to welcome the German army into its depths. The stage is set for the Battle of Kursk, the final turning point on the Eastern Front. July 5, 1943, Operation Citadel, the largest tank battle in human history, is unleashed. In the north, the German 9th Army, commanded by the formidable General Walter Model, smashes headfirst into the heavily fortified Soviet defenses. This was supposed to be the decisive northern pincer, a hammer blow designed to encircle and annihilate the Red Army in the Kursk salient. The plan was audacious, a classic German blitzkrieg maneuver. But on the blood-soaked fields of Kursk, the lightning war would die a swift and brutal death, not in days or weeks, but in a matter of hours. Model's force was a sight to behold, a concentration of some of the Third Reich's most advanced and fearsome war machines. Spearheading the assault were the brand-new heavyweights, the legendary Tiger tank, and the colossal Ferdinand tank destroyer. On paper, they were invincible. The Tiger's 88mm gun could pick off Soviet T-34s from a mile away, and its thick frontal armor was practically immune to return fire. The Ferdinand, with its even more powerful gun and monstrous 200mm of frontal armor, was a mobile fortress, designed to punch through any defense imaginable. The German High Command placed immense faith in these steel behemoths. They were the game changers, the super weapons that that would finally break the back of the Red Army. But war isn't fought on paper. As the German formations rumbled forward across the rolling steppe, they immediately ran into a nightmare landscape, a defensive web of unprecedented depth and complexity. The Soviets, forewarned by their intelligence network, had spent months preparing for this exact moment. They had turned the Kursk salient into a fortress. The ground was saturated with mines, millions of them, anti-tank mines, anti-personnel mines, wooden mines, even booby-trap shells. The Germans were advancing not across open fields, but through what they called the pack front, a dense, layered network of camouflaged anti-tank guns. The new German tanks, for all their power, had critical weaknesses. The Tigers and Ferdinands were slow, ponderous beasts. They guzzled fuel at an alarming rate and were notoriously unreliable mechanically. Transmissions broke down, engines overheated. The Soviets had brilliantly anticipated the German attack routes, funneling these mechanical giants directly into the densest minefields. The effect was immediate and devastating. A thunderous explosion, a lurch, and a plume of black smoke would signal another Tiger or Ferdinand immobilized, its tracks blown clean off. And once a tank was stopped, it became a sitting duck. The moment a German behemoth was crippled in a minefield, a deadly ballet began. From hidden, dug-in positions, Soviet anti-tank guns would open up. 76.2mm cannons, expertly concealed, would begin hammering away at the tank's weaker side and rear armor. Teams of infantry, armed with anti-tank rifles and Molotov cocktails, would swarm the disabled vehicle. The air became thick with the crack of high-velocity shells and the roar of explosions. For the crews trapped inside these steel coffins, it was hell on earth. The immense firepower that made them so deadly on the move was useless when they were trapped and exposed. The battle devolved into a brutal, agonizing meat grinder. German storm pioneers, the elite combat engineers, were sent forward under withering fire to clear paths through the minefields. It was a suicidal task. For every mine they cleared, another seemed to take its place, and Soviet artillery rained down upon them relentlessly. The infantry following the tanks found themselves pinned down in a storm of machine gun and mortar fire. The coordination that was the hallmark of Blitzkrieg simply fell apart. Tanks couldn't advance without infantry support, and infantry couldn't advance without the tanks clearing the way. They were caught in a vicious, bloody stalemate. The fighting was savage and personal. It was a desperate struggle for every trench, every hill, every meter of scorched earth. German soldiers who had fought on every front described the fighting in the north of Kursk as the most horrific they had ever experienced. The initial German optimism evaporated within the first day, replaced by a grim realization that they were fighting a battle of attrition they could not win. The elite German divisions were being bled white for minuscule gains. After one full week of this relentless, horrific slaughter, the reality of the situation was undeniable. Walter Model's Northern Pincer, the mighty arm of Operation Citadel, had advanced less than 10 miles. In some sectors, they had gained only a few kilometers. The cost was staggering. Hundreds of tanks, including many of the irreplaceable Tigers and Ferdinands, were left as smoldering wrecks littering the battlefield. The infantry divisions had suffered catastrophic losses. The attack had not just stalled. It had completely and utterly failed. The Northern Pincer was broken. The great German summer offensive of 1943 had been stopped dead in its tracks, ground to a bloody halt in the meticulously prepared defenses of the Red Army. The dream of a decisive victory on the Eastern Front died right there, in the minefields and anti-tank ditches north of Kursk. In the south, the situation is far more critical for the Soviets. Here, the German offensive is led by none other than the master of mobile warfare, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. His 4th Panzer Army is the spearhead, and at its very tip are the most feared, most elite fighting formations in the entire German military, the SS Panzer Corps. This isn't just any unit, It's comprised of the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf divisions. These are men indoctrinated from youth, battle-hardened on every front, and equipped with the very best tanks and weapons Germany can produce. They are fanatically loyal and brutally effective. Manstein's plan is a classic armored punch, designed to shatter the Soviet defenses and drive deep into their rear, linking up with the northern pincer and encircling a massive portion of the Red Army. Unlike the northern front, where the Germans were quickly bogged down, Manstein's southern attack shows terrifying promise. The SS Panzer Corps smashes into the Soviet lines with ferocious intensity. The first line of defense, manned by the 6th Guards Army, is heavily fortified, but the sheer weight and aggression of the SS attack are overwhelming. The Panzers, supported by waves of Stuka dive bombers, blast their way through trenches, minefields, and anti-tank gun nests. The fighting is savage, with no quarter asked and none given. Soviet soldiers fight with desperate courage, often to the last man, but they cannot halt the German advance. The first defensive belt is breached. The SS Panzer Corps, though bleeding heavily, pushes onward. They hit the second Soviet line, held by the 1st Tank Army. Here, the resistance stiffens even further. Vicious tank-on-tank battles erupt across the rolling steppe. German Tigers, with their powerful 88mm guns, duel with Soviet T-34s. The T-34 is a superb tank, but it is often outgunned by the Tiger and the newer Panther tanks that are making their debut here at Kursk. Despite this, the Soviets have numbers on their side and a fanatical determination to hold their ground. The fields are littered with the burning hulks of tanks from both sides. Every meter of ground is paid for in blood and steel. The SS divisions are taking horrific casualties, losing men and machines at an unsustainable rate, but they refuse to stop. They are a force of pure momentum, and slowly, agonizingly, they tear a hole through the second Soviet line as well. After days of relentless, brutal combat, the German spearhead has penetrated deep into the Soviet defenses. They've advanced over 30 kilometers, a significant gain compared to the stalemate in the north. They are exhausted, their units are battered and under strength, but they are on the verge of a breakthrough. Ahead of them lies open country, the operational depth they so desperately need to reach. Standing in their way is a small, seemingly insignificant railway station and collective farm. The name of this village is Prokhorovka. It doesn't look like much on a map, but it's about to become the epicenter of the largest tank battle in human history. The SS Panzer Corps gathers its remaining strength for one final push, believing victory is within their grasp. They have no idea what awaits them. Back at Soviet headquarters, Stavka, the High Command, is watching the southern front with grave concern. The situation is precarious. Manstein's advance threatens to unravel their entire defensive strategy. But this is the moment Georgy Zhukov has been planning for. While his frontline armies were absorbing the German onslaught, he was holding a massive force in secret, far behind the lines. This was his strategic reserve, an entire army kept hidden from German intelligence. It's the 5th Guards Tank Army, a fresh, powerful formation with over 800 tanks, including hundreds of T-34s. As the battered SS Panzer divisions approach Prokhorovka, Zhukov makes his move. He picks up the phone and gives the order to his commander on the ground, General Pavel Rotmistrov. The order is simple: unleash the 5th Guards Tank Army. Attack, counterattack now. It's the ultimate gamble. Zhukov is throwing his last major reserve into the fray, committing everything to stop Manstein's spearhead once and for all. The stage is now set for the legendary clash at Prokhorovka, a titanic collision of armor that will define the Battle of Kursk and, in many ways, the rest of the war on the Eastern Front. Two of the most powerful armored forces ever assembled are on a direct collision course. The fate of Operation Citadel hangs in the balance, and the fields around this tiny Russian village are about to be turned into a fiery hellscape. Imagine a summer morning on the vast, rolling plains of Russia. It's July 12, 1943. The air is thick, not just with the summer heat, but with the metallic smell of gasoline, oil, and impending conflict. This day would go down in history, not as a masterclass in military strategy, but as a brutal, medieval-style brawl on an epic scale. This was the Battle of Prokhorovka, a clash that would become the stuff of legend, a defining moment of the Eastern Front. The stage for this titanic confrontation was set within the larger context of the Battle of Kursk. The Germans had launched Operation Citadel, a massive offensive designed to encircle and destroy the Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. They believed this would be the decisive blow that would turn the tide of the war in their favor. The southern pincer of this attack was spearheaded by the elite SS Panzer Corps, a formidable force equipped with the latest and greatest of German armor, the fearsome Tiger and Panther tanks, alongside the workhorse Panzer Ives and Stug assault guns. These were machines of unprecedented power. Their thick armor and long range, high-velocity 88mm guns capable of destroying Soviet tanks from over a mile away. Facing them was the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Pavel Rotmistrov. His forces were a mix of tank types, but the backbone was the legendary T-34. The T-34 was a revolutionary design, with its sloped armor and good mobility, but its 76mm gun was no match for the frontal armor of a Tiger at long range. The Soviets knew this. They couldn't win a long-range duel. Their only hope was to close the distance, to turn a sniper's duel into a knife fight. As dawn broke, the German tanks of the SS Panzer divisions Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf began to advance across a narrow corridor of land, flanked by a railway embankment on one side and the Sel River on the other. They were confident, their crew seasoned veterans, their machines seemingly invincible. They expected to punch through the Soviet lines and complete the encirclement. They had no idea what was waiting for them just over the horizon. Suddenly, the ground began to tremble. A low rumble grew into a deafening roar. Over the crest of a hill, a wave of Soviet armor appeared. It wasn't a cautious advance. It was a full-throttle charge. Hundreds upon hundreds of T-34s, along with lighter T-70s, and even some British-supplied Churchill tanks, surged forward in a seemingly endless tide. They weren't maneuvering or seeking cover. They were charging straight at the German lines, a wave of steel and fury. The German tank gunners, initially stunned by the sheer scale of the assault, quickly recovered. Their powerful 88mm guns began to bark, sending armor-piercing shells screaming across the plain. Soviet tanks erupted in flames, their turrets blown clean off their hulls. The initial losses were horrific, but the Soviet wave did not stop. For every tank that was destroyed, two more seemed to take its place. The Soviet commanders had given a chillingly simple order: get close. The T-34 crews understood their mission. They had to negate the Germans' long-range advantage. They had to get inside the effective range of the Tiger's guns, to get so close that the massive German cannons couldn't depress low enough to hit them. They drove with what can only be described as suicidal bravery, their foot pressed hard on the accelerator, racing through a maelstrom of explosions and flying shrapnel. The tank armies collided with a cataclysmic crash. The orderly lines of battle disintegrated into a chaotic, swirling melee. This was the death ride. Nearly 1,200 tanks and assault guns were now locked in a desperate struggle at point-blank range. Visibility dropped to near zero as dust kicked up by hundreds of tank treads mixed with the thick, black smoke from burning machines. The battlefield became a surreal hellscape. A German Panzer IV might find itself suddenly swarmed by 3 T-34s. A Tiger, the apex predator of the battlefield, would turn its turret to engage one target, only to be struck from the flank by another. The noise was indescribable: the roar of engines, the screech of metal on metal, the sharp crack of cannons firing, and the thunderous crump of high-explosive shells detonating. In this close-quarters chaos, the Soviets' desperate tactic began to work. T-34 crews, unable to penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor, aimed for their weaker side and rear armor. Some, in a final act of desperation, simply rammed the German behemoths. The impact would shatter their own tank's tracks and suspension, but it could also disable a German tank, locking the two machines together in a fatal embrace. When tanks were immobilized, the fight wasn't over. Crews bailed out of their burning vehicles, only to continue the battle on foot. Tankers fought each other with pistols, submachine guns, and even knives and entrenching tools amidst the burning wreckage. It was a primal, hand-to-hand struggle for survival in a graveyard of steel. A Soviet tanker might leap onto the engine deck of a Tiger, trying to pry open a hatch or stuff a grenade into an air intake. One famous account tells of a T-34 commander who rammed a Tiger head-on. Both tanks were crippled. The Soviet crew bailed out and engaged the German crew in a firefight around their wrecked machines. This was happening all over the field. It wasn't a battle of tactics anymore. It was a battle of will, of sheer, brute force attrition. The German Panzer crews, who had felt invincible just hours before, were now fighting for their lives in a confusing, terrifying brawl. Their superior technology was being neutralized by sheer numbers and the fanatical courage of their enemy. They were firing as fast as they could reload, but the red stars of the Soviet tanks just kept coming, appearing out of the smoke like phantoms. By the end of the day, the fighting subsided. The plain of Prokhorovka was a smoking ruin. The ground was littered with hundreds of blackened, twisted hulks of armor. It looked like a scrapyard from hell. The air was thick with the stench of burning fuel, cordite, and death. Both sides had suffered staggering losses. The 5th Guards Tank Army was shattered as a fighting force, having lost a huge percentage of its tanks, but they had achieved their objective. The elite SS Panzer Corps was stopped cold. Their offensive momentum was broken, their spearhead blunted and bloodied. They had lost a significant number of their precious Tigers and Panthers, tanks that were difficult and expensive to replace. The German offensive at Kursk had faltered, and with it, their last great hope for victory on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Prokhorovka was not a tactical victory for either side in the traditional sense. It was a slugfest that resulted in a strategic victory for the Soviets. They had been willing to pay an almost unbelievable price in men and machines to halt the German advance. This battle symbolized the turning point of the war. From this day forward, the German army would be on the defensive, pushed back relentlessly towards Berlin. The death ride at Prokhorovka remains one of the largest and most ferocious tank battles in history. It was a testament to the brutal nature of the Eastern Front and the incredible courage of the soldiers who fought there. It was a day when tactics gave way to raw courage, and a wave of steel met an immovable object, leaving behind a field of silent, smoking monuments to the cost of war. The Battle of Kursk is over, July 12, 1943, on the scarred and smoking fields of Prokhorovka. The greatest tank battle in history has reached its brutal climax. The German 4th Panzer Army, battered and bruised, has failed to break through. Hitler, seeing the writing on the wall, officially cancels Operation Citadel. He blames the Allied landing in Sicily, a convenient excuse to save face, but everyone on the ground knows the truth. This wasn't just a setback, it was a disaster. Germany's final, desperate gamble on the Eastern Front had failed. The cream of the Panzerwaffe, the elite tank crews and their formidable Tigers and Panthers, lay wrecked across the steppe or were pulling back, exhausted and demoralized. For 2 years, the German soldier had known only victory, pushing ever deeper into the heart of Russia. But after Kursk, that momentum was broken, forever. The initiative had shifted. The Red Army, however, was just getting started. They hadn't just weathered the storm, they had been preparing to unleash a hurricane of their own. Even as the last German tanks sputtered back from Prokhorovka, the Soviet counter-offensive was already in motion. This wasn't a hasty reaction. It was a meticulously planned, two-pronged assault designed to shatter the weakened German lines. To the north of the Kursk salient, Operation Citadel slammed into the German Ninth Army's flank. To the south, Operation Remyontsov was poised to strike the very same panzer divisions that had just bled themselves dry. The hunter had become the hunted. The scale of these Soviet operations was immense, dwarfing even the German offensive. Stalin and his Stavka, the Soviet High Command, had amassed staggering numbers of men, tanks, and artillery. They had learned from their defeats in 1941 and 1942. They now possessed a deep understanding of German tactics and had developed their own sophisticated doctrine of deep battle, or glubokaya operacja. This wasn't just about pushing the Germans back. It was about encircling and annihilating them. While the Germans were masters of the operational encirclement, the Soviets were now aiming for a strategic-level destruction. The plan was simple and ruthless: hit the Germans where they were weakest, punch through their lines, and unleash armored corps deep into their rear, cutting supply lines and creating chaos. On July 12th, the same day Hitler cancelled Citadel, the Western and Bryansk fronts opened up with a terrifying artillery barrage, signaling the start of Operation Citadel. Thousands of guns pounded the German positions around Orel. The German soldiers of Army Group Center, who thought they were on the offensive just days before, were now caught in a defensive nightmare. They were dug in, yes, but they were exhausted. Their reserves were depleted, and they were facing a Red Army that was now better equipped, better led, and fighting with a ferocious determination. The Soviets threw wave after wave of infantry and T-34s at the German lines. The fighting was savage. German strongpoints, built up over months, became scenes of desperate, close-quarters combat. The German command, under Field Marshal von Kluge, was in a state of shock. They had committed their best units to the southern pincer of Citadel and had little left to counter this new threat. They scrambled to pull divisions from other sectors, but it was like trying to plug a dam with their fingers. For every gap they closed, the Soviets blasted open to more. The city of Orel, a critical German bastion and supply hub, was the primary target. For weeks, the battle raged. The Germans fought with their characteristic tenacity, launching local counterattacks and making the Soviets pay for every yard of ground. But the sheer weight of Soviet numbers and material was overwhelming. By early August, the German Ninth Army was facing encirclement, and Hitler was finally forced to authorize a withdrawal. On August 5th, Orel was liberated. It was a massive symbolic and strategic victory for the Red Army. Simultaneously, down south, the stage was set for the second act, Operation Remyontsov, named after an 18th-century Russian field marshal famous for his victories. The objective was even more ambitious: the liberation of Belgorod and Kharkiv. The Voronezh and Steppe fronts, commanded by titans like Vachitin and Konev, had been held back during the defensive phase of Kursk, preserving their strength. Now, on August 3rd, they were unleashed. Once again, a colossal artillery bombardment paved the way. The German 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kempf, the very forces that had spearheaded the attack on Kursk, now found themselves on the receiving end of a Soviet blitzkrieg. The German panzer divisions, the pride of the Wehrmacht, were a shadow of their former selves. The battles at Prokhorovka had cost them dearly. They were short on tanks, ammunition, and fuel. The crews were bone-weary. They were now facing fresh Soviet tank armies, equipped with thousands of T-34s and supported by endless columns of infantry. The speed of the Soviet advance was breathtaking. They bypassed strongpoints, drove deep into the German rear, and aimed for the vital city of Kharkiv, the third largest city in the Soviet Union and a place that had changed hands 3 times already. Field Marshal von Manstein, one of Germany's most brilliant commanders, tried to orchestrate a fighting withdrawal, trading space for time and hoping to inflict heavy casualties on the overextended Soviets. He launched counterattacks with his depleted Panzer Corps, including the elite Das Reich and Totenkopf divisions. At times, they achieved local successes, temporarily halting the Soviet juggernaut and creating moments of intense crisis for the Red Army commanders. But it was not enough. The Soviets had learned to absorb these counterpunches and keep moving forward. They had reserves that Manstein could only dream of. For every T-34 knocked out, two more seemed to appear over the horizon. The industrial might of the Soviet Union, relocated beyond the Urals, was now running at full tilt, churning out weapons of war at an astonishing rate. The battle for Kharkiv was the culmination of the offensive. The Germans turned the city into a fortress, but their position was untenable. With Soviet forces threatening to encircle them completely, the order was given to abandon the city. On August 23, 1943, Soviet soldiers once again raised the red flag over Kharkiv, this time for good. The liberation of Belgorod and Kharkiv marked the definitive end of the Battle of the Kursk salient. The Germans had lost two vital anchors of their front line and had been thrown back over 100 miles. The consequences of these twin Soviet offensives were profound. The Wehrmacht had lost the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front permanently. The staggering losses in men and, crucially, in tanks and experienced crews at Kursk and in the subsequent battles were irreplaceable. Germany's war economy simply could not keep up. From this point forward, the German soldier on the Eastern Front would almost never be on the attack again. His new reality was one of constant retreat, of desperate defensive battles against an ever stronger, a more confident enemy. He would be fighting for survival, not for conquest. For the Soviet Union, it was a turning point of immense psychological and strategic importance. The victories at Orel, Belgorod, and Kharkiv proved that the Red Army could not only defend, but could also conduct complex, large-scale offensive operations and beat the Germans at their own game. The myth of German invincibility, already cracked at Moscow and shattered at Stalingrad, was now ground into dust on the plains of Kursk. The road to Berlin was now open. It would be a long and bloody road, filled with more horrific battles and immense suffering, but the final outcome was no longer in doubt. The unbreakable Red Army had absorbed the enemy's mightiest blow, and was now beginning the relentless march westward, a march that would end in the ruins of the Reichstag 2 years later. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this history fascinating, please hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into military history, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. We'll see you in the next one.